Well, hello everyone, and welcome and good evening to this evening's Thinking, and a very special welcome to Rutger Bregman, who I think is quite simply one of the most important and interesting writers around in the world today, and we're very lucky to have him with us tonight. And he's also published a book which I think, as you'll find if you have or haven't read it, is really a genuinely challenging and fascinating exploration of everything that consists of humanity, and it is indeed called Humankind, A Hopeful History. Now, Rutger, last time I interviewed you, you were talking about your bestseller of the time, Utopia for Realists. And now with Humankind, you've advanced what you describe as a radical idea. And I'm quoting this radical idea, that most people deep down are pretty decent. So can you kind of explain, first of all, what the journey that took you to that, and why it's a radical idea?
Sure. You know, the reason I wanted to write this book is that I started to notice that so many scientists from very different disciplines, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and many of them were moving from a quite cynical view of human nature to a more hopeful and positive view. And I also seem to get the impression that they often don't know it from each other, because as you know, in academia, everyone is very specialized these days, you know, super specialized. So I talked to all these brilliant people who know, you know, a huge amount about a very small part of the puzzle. And yeah, there was one moment where I was talking to a psychologist. Her name is Marie Lindegaard, a Dutch-Danish psychologist. And she'd done really path-breaking research into the bystander effect. You know, what happens when there's an emergency? Someone's drowning, someone's being attacked in the street. Do we actually help each other or not really? And she's done some really fascinating research based on CCTV footage, where she discovered that actually in 90% of all cases, people do help each other. I had interviewed her about that. Then after the interview, you know, we just had a little bit of conversation about other stuff. And I was mentioned that I had just written an essay about, you know, empathy based on the research of Frans de Waal, you know, the primatologist, and sort of described what's going on in biology and evolutionary anthropology. And then she said, oh my God, so it's happening there as well. Meaning the same shift is happening also in biology, not only psychology. And that's when I realized, hey, that's fascinating. Someone should connect the dots. Maybe this is a book if I sort of try and bring this all together and show that something bigger is going on.
So the interesting thing, I suppose, is that the default position in the capitalist system, and to a great extent the architecture of the modern state, is that left to themselves, people will not behave decently. And you pay particular attention to the ideas of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Can you tell us, Rutger, why it is to such an extent, and really across left and right, that that people aren't actually fundamentally decent? Why has that become the almost platitudinously seems to be the case?
Yeah, it's a very old idea in Western culture, which, well, Frans de Waal, the primatologist, calls it veneer theory. The notion that our civilization is only just a thin veneer, and that below that, you know, human nature is really selfish, that deep down we're all just animals or beasts or savages. Now, that idea is, I think, very deeply embedded in Western culture. You can find it among the ancient Greeks. You can find it within, you know, Orthodox Christianity. You can find it with the Enlightenment philosophers. You would expect some break there, right? That they sort of change their mind on human nature. But it's actually interesting if you study the works of, you know, the founding fathers of the United States, or people like Thomas Hobbes or Adam Smith. I think that very often you see this veneer theory coming back again and again. And you could also argue that at the heart of our current capitalist system is also this idea that people are just selfish. That is the case if you look at sort of how neoliberal thought has evolved, which I think very much was centered around the values of individualism and selfishness. So yeah, it's a very old idea in Western culture. It comes back again and again, both among people who are religious or atheists or right-wing or left-wing. And I think sort of the fundamental, deeper reason that it comes back again and again is that it's in the interest of those in power, because cynicism is the great legitimization of inequality and power differences. If people can't trust each other, then they need a leviathan. They need a ruler, someone to take charge and to keep us in check, because freedom would have terrible consequences. If people can actually trust each other, as, for example, the anarchists believed already in the 19th century, people like Kropotkin, for example, the Russian anarchist, well, that has dangerous and subversive implications, because it means that we could move to a much more democratic, egalitarian society, and that maybe we don't need the Tsar or the king or all these CEOs and managers, etc. So I think that those at the top have always understood that a more hopeful view of human nature may sound nice, but is actually very dangerous.
I can already see some fascinating comments coming in the chat, which is being run by a brilliant colleague, Liz Mosley. Please do chip in if you have thoughts, and we'll be coming to you very soon. I wanted, though, before then, Rutger, just to look at some of the, you can't go on all of the journey that you went on, because it's an extraordinary one and well worth reading in full. But you cite some interesting episodes that suggest that there is some sort of core decency in humankind, the so-called blitz spirit, the way that people behave well to one another, Katrina, the amazing courage shown on 9/11. But I wondered if you could zero in on one thing in particular, which is that, not surprisingly, I suppose you had a series of obstacles to your thesis, and huge, like 2001 monolith was the Lord of the Flies, William Golding's famous book about maroon schoolboys who resort to evil when left to their own devices. And obviously this has become much more than a novel. It's become a sort of manual of human psychology and taken as a route into the darkness of man's heart, to use a line from the book. Tell us what you found that suggested that William Golding got it wrong.
Well, this is certainly where I had the most fun writing my book, because I just wondered whether it had ever really happened. Lord of the Flies is fiction, great fiction probably. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize for a reason. But I just wondered whether it had ever happened. So I started looking for a real historical case when real kids did actually shipwreck on an island, and I was curious how they would behave. And it took almost a year, but I managed to find a story of something that happened in 1965 and 1966 on Tonga, which is an island group in the Pacific Ocean, where 6 kids were stranded, shipwrecked on an island. They were students of a boarding school in Nuku'alofa, which is the capital of Tonga. And they didn't like school. They hated the school meals. So they said, you know what, we're going to go on an adventure. They borrowed a boat. They ended up in a storm, then drifted for 8 days, shipwrecked on this island, and somehow managed to survive for 15 months. And so I was obviously very curious how they did it, and managed to track down a couple of the real life, or sort of the original Lord of the Flies children. They're now in their early 70s. And I also managed to find the captain who found them. His name is Peter Warner. He's now 90 years old. And together they told me the story of what really happened. And the thing is, if this would be a Hollywood movie, then people would say, well, this is such a naive and sentimental story, you know, that's highly unrealistic. This is worse than Love Actually. But the thing is, it really happened. So they survived by doing pretty much the opposite of everything that happens in the fictional Lord of the Flies. They worked in teams of two to be on the lookout, two to tend to the garden, two to cook. They sometimes had fights. I mean, that happens. They're humans after all. But then one would go to one side of the island, the other would go to the other side of the island, cool off a little bit, come back and say sorry. So yeah, it was really astonishing for me that this story is the complete opposite. And then you can say, well, it's not exactly a scientific experiment and it's just one story of something that happened a long time ago. But then I think it's important to remember that we humans, we often become the stories that we tell ourselves. Lord of the Flies had such an extraordinary influence on, you know, just how people look at the world. I mean, millions of kids around the globe were basically forced to read it. And what are they meant to take away from that when, you know, you're 15 or 16 years old? It's basically like, wow, maybe I should become a little bit more cynical about human nature. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't read Lord of the Flies. I'm only saying that if they read it, let's also tell them about the one time that we actually know of when real kids shipwrecked on a real island, because that's a very different story.
So another example from the book which really leapt out at me was a statistic from the Battle of Gettysburg, that 90% of the muskets that were retrieved from the battlefield didn't appear to have been discharged. And this led you into some very interesting terrain about how many soldiers actually do or don't shoot at all, let alone shoot to kill, in situations where folklore history assumes that they've been in violent conflict.
Yeah, this is really an extraordinary phenomenon that was first discovered by an American historian and colonel, S.L.A. Marshall. So in 1944 and 1945, he was allowed by the American military to travel with the troops in both the Pacific and in Europe, and to conduct group interviews just after battle. So he sort of put people together and said, okay, what actually happened? And he was the first one to discover that many, many soldiers didn't actually fire their guns. He had a sort of a rough estimate. He said that only 15 to 25% of soldiers fired their guns. That was really taken very seriously by the US military. They completely changed their training after they had read Marshall's work. It also became controversial afterwards because, I mean, it's quite a shocking finding, right? That supposedly 70 to 80% of soldiers who are drafted into an army don't actually fire their guns. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. It goes against everything what we think we know. It's very much the opposite of what we see in all the movies, right? But actually, since then, a lot more research has come in, both from historians and also from psychologists, who have found that actually violence, we are capable of it as a species, obviously we are, but we find it quite hard, especially when there's too little distance. So if you look at military technology, it's relatively easy to push a button on an artillery device and then have an explosion far away and kill a lot of people. We know that around 80% of all casualties during World War I and World War II were caused by these sort of long distance weapons. But it's very, very hard to use a bayonet, for example, and to shove a bayonet down someone. Most bayonets in, for example, the First World War were never used because most soldiers couldn't do it. They were not conditioned or brainwashed, or they were just average drafted soldiers and they couldn't do it. So what usually happened, there's one historian who says this, if two armies approached each other with their bayonets, usually, you know, one side would remember an urgent appointment elsewhere and would go away. So that doesn't mean that people are incapable of violence, but it does mean that we need ways to increase the distance, both the physical distance and the psychological distance, to actually enable the killing. But then often we also kill something within ourselves. So, and this is where killing is very different from, for example, eating food or sex, which are, I mean, it's pretty clear with the evolutionary advantages there. But killing someone else, there's a lot of evidence that if soldiers come back from war and they have actually killed, that they develop PTSD and are traumatized. which suggests to me that even though we are capable of horrific violence, it's not really what we're born to do. I mean, we do pay a high price for it.
I just want to look at some of the really striking and paradoxical sort of core claims. I mean, one is that to some extent your book is arguing that civilization, barring perhaps the last 200 years, has been the problem, not the solution, and that at the end of the last ice age, 50,000 years ago, we ended our nomadic existence, got into farming, property, politics, religion, and the state. And you very strikingly describe the birth of the state as a catastrophic event. Now, can you explain that a little bit more? Because it's a huge assertion.
Yeah, sure. You know, the standard shape of history is often being described or shown like this, right? That history is this march of progress where, you know, in the past, we were all these poor hunter-gatherers and we lived lives that were, in Thomas Hobbes' famous words, nasty, brutish, and short. But then came civilization. Then we settled down, we invented agriculture, we started living in villages and cities, we invented writing, we invented the wheel, and slowly but gradually, you know, life improved and we became richer and we became more civilized. So it's sort of the march of progress. I think that often when people think about history, they sort of have that shape in their head. What most archaeologists and anthropologists and historians now believe is, I think, pretty much the opposite. It's more like that life was like sort of like this when we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. You know, pretty good. You know, we had a relatively short work week of around 25, 30 hours. We were relatively healthy, you know, quite some exercise, a varied diet of fruit, vegetables, and meat. These societies were probably quite egalitarian as well, little hierarchy, little inequality, proto-feminists, you could argue. So not too bad. I mean, not paradise, but not too bad. Then came civilization, and civilization was a total, complete disaster for most people. You know, it brought us the age of warfare, of hierarchy, of patriarchy, of infection diseases, all these infection diseases like measles or the plague or malaria or COVID-19, right? They're all modern diseases because we domesticated animals and we were living too close to them. So yeah, then it basically went like this. That was the case for around 10,000 years. Then we had the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and then the two world wars. And then especially after that, we've seen a huge amount of progress. So now we're obviously richer, wealthier, healthier than ever, if you live in the right country. But that is a very recent phenomenon. It's like this, it's a very small percentage of the whole history of civilization, and an even smaller percentage of the whole history of humanity. And the question is obviously, how sustainable is it? I mean, we've got climate change coming at us. We've got the extinction of species. We might be dancing on top of a volcano right now. So first you have this march of progress, and now you have this view of history where there's a long period of stability, then civilization, everything crashes, huge amount of progress, and I don't know, it's too early to say where this is going to end, but it's a very different take on our history than the standard interpretation.
Well, looking at the contemporary, and I do want to come back to COVID, but obviously we're in an age now of cantonization and tribalism, and that's been, you know, weaponized by social media and polarization and so forth, and othering. And you have a very interesting and certainly to me very new take on this, that our capacity for empathy may actually be a big part of our capacity for tribalism. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure.
Such a counterintuitive idea.
Yeah, it's really the paradox that's at the heart of my book. So on the one hand, evolutionary biologists now believe that we have evolved to be friendly. And they literally talk about survival of the friendliest. It's a great new book just by Brian Hare, one of the more important researchers in the field. So that means that for millennia, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation, because friendliness was an evolutionary advantage. If you had more friends, then you had a bigger chance of surviving. Imagine Donald Trump in prehistory. Well, he wouldn't have survived for long. You know, people didn't like narcissists. It would probably would have been banned from the group and would have died alone. That also has another side, though. I mean, friendliness can change into followership behavior or tribal behavior or groupish behavior, as some people call it. And if you look at the greatest atrocities also in history and our great crimes, they're often committed in the name of comradeship and of loyalty and of staying true to your friends. I've got one chapter in the book about why the soldiers, the German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, kept on fighting in 1944 and 1945 when it was absolutely clear that they were going to lose the war. And at first, the Allied psychologists believed that these soldiers, well, must have been brainwashed, right? That they were these fanatic robots, just fighting, because they really believed in the cause. But then psychologists started interviewing prisoners of war, and we've got much more evidence that was collected later that really shows convincingly, I believe, that most of these soldiers were fighting for their comrades. And that this was really the most important motivating force within the German army, even stronger than in Allied armies. They just knew each other really well, and they had been through so much together, and they would never let their friends down. And so they kept on fighting, even in 1945, when it was clear that everything was lost. And yeah, I mean, we only have to look at the history of the Middle East, where you see these cycles of empathy and then the call for vengeance, right? Where it goes on and on and on. You only need to look at that and realize that, hey, wait a minute, maybe more empathy, more feeling for your own people, you know, more spotlight on the people that are like you and that are already part of your group is maybe not going to be the solution.
You have to deal with, obviously, and do deal with the problem of Auschwitz in the book. And as you mentioned, you talk a lot about the capacity of camaraderie and, I suppose, for want of a better word, group loyalty to lead people to do the most appalling things. Do you think that is sufficient? I mean, the sheer scale of the Holocaust and the kind of strategic desire to wipe out industrially an entire people.
Absolutely. You know, I've been in these situations, Matthew, where you do interviews for radio, for example, and it goes like, hey, you've written a book, Humankind, you know, a hopeful history about human nature. What about Auschwitz?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
well, do you want a 2-minute answer, right? So obviously, I mean, it's an extraordinary complex historical event, and libraries full of books have been written about it. And, you know, the thing I just mentioned, you know, the role of camaraderie and loyalty can only be a small part of the puzzle, obviously. I think what I tried to do in the first place in the book is to show that veneer theory is wrong. So after the Second World War, veneer theory really made a comeback. And there were all these social psychologists like Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo with their famous experiments, you know, the shock machine experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, in which they try to show that there's a Nazi in each and every one of us, that people can quickly turn into monsters. And that was sort of their explanation of the Holocaust. You know, it's just below the surface in human nature. And as a historian, I've always believed that really trivialized Auschwitz and the Holocaust. It really sort of made it seem as though just happens like that. Well, obviously, it was the very dark end after a very dark road. You know, that was, you know, that you have to go back all the way to the 19th century probably to understand it in German history. So I've always felt that it was trivialized in that way. And in the book, I look at a couple of mechanisms that I think are really important. One of them is indeed loyalty. The other thing is really, you know, distance. I mean, the Nazis themselves discovered that it was simply too hard to keep on shooting Jews, and that they needed to have some technological breakthrough, which was the gas chamber, which made it more doable to kill so many people on such a large scale. None of this is meant to sort of make people feel comfortable. I mean, some people are like, yeah, get the impression that I've written a happy clappy book about how human beings are fundamentally good. No, actually a big part of the book is about this great paradox. How is it possible that a species that has evolved to work together, to often be friendly, and that is our secret superpower, how can exactly that same species also be the cruelest in the whole animal kingdom? Because we do things that no penguin would ever come up with, yeah, right? We lock up groups of people, we kill them, we exterminate them. So a big part of the book is about that, and I don't have one answer to that, and I think it could have been thousands of pages longer, obviously, if you want to look at all the mechanisms. But I look at a couple of mechanisms that I think are really important.
So, looking at some of the forward-looking things you recommend, you're very keen on hands-off management and a different form of education. Now, we're living in an age where, to some extent, people are calling out for strong leadership. You're arguing for something more subtle and nuanced. Why is that?
Well, the second half of the book is about putting the theory into practice, because I think that our views of human nature, they're not innocent. They have real life practical consequences, because what you assume in other people is what you get out of them. For a pretty long time, we've very often designed our institutions, our schools, our workplaces around the notion that people are just selfish. And if you have a view like that, then you quickly start believing in the need for hierarchy. You need what Thomas Hobbes called a Leviathan, someone to take charge. Well, if you believe that people can actually handle freedom and work together, and that you can rely on their intrinsic motivation, then you can build your institutions in a very different way. And I think it can actually also create the kind of people that your theory presupposes, because what you assume often is what you get. Now, that's indeed what one chapter of the book is about when it comes to the workplace. I think there's a strong tendency, or has been a strong tendency in many Western countries, for more management and more layers of bureaucracy and more control, or whatever you want to call it. And I think the results haven't been great. So in that chapter, I look at a case study of a company or an organization that does the complete opposite. It's called Neighborhood Care, Buurtzorg in the Netherlands. They've got 15,000 employees and 0 managers. And they do everything in self-directed teams, because they sort of assume that, the employees themselves, the nurses in this case themselves, they are the real experts on their own jobs. And so these teams decide for themselves what additional education they need, who they're going to hire as colleagues, etc. And the results are absolutely phenomenal. So this is the best healthcare organization we have in the Netherlands, that delivers really high quality healthcare at a cheaper cost actually than the competitors, while paying the employees a higher salary. So that is something I'm interested in, sort of the implications of how can we organize things differently once we move to this more realistic view of human nature.
I want to come back to COVID and so on, but Jane Fox has an interesting question about othering. Jane, I don't know if you're there. If we can get you. There you are.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Okay.
Great. Fire away.
Well, I just made it as a comment rather than a question, and it's in response to the idea of how is it that these things can happen, these terrible, unbelievably awful things that happen, that, man's inhumanity to man. Mm-hmm. I think that the way that we are able to do it is by othering. So mm-hmm. If it's someone else, if they are other than us, than I am, then, and if I perceive my need for survival to be such that I have to preference myself or my unit above them, then it's almost, it's a kind of dehumanization. And I think it's not that difficult. I'm sorry, I've got some kind of bug here in the it's not so difficult. I mean, I think it's also depends on the education of the individual. And I don't mean in terms of academic education. I think we have to be sensitized to feel other people's pain. I don't think that we are necessarily born empathic, but that we can be taught, educated to develop empathy. And that is the antidote to the othering. If we can't feel another person's pain, then we can do anything. Doesn't matter if it suits me. So really, I'm just making a comment. I'm not I'm being controversial or argumentative, but just that point, yeah.
Well, it's a great comment. I've got a couple of thoughts about it. So on the one thing, there's actually a fascinating book that was recently published by a psychologist called Paul Bloom. And the book has a very provocative title, which is Against Empathy. Now you may think, oh, that sounds like a horrible book, but it's actually a pretty great book. Paul Bloom has an issue with empathy because he thinks that there are important psychological limits to empathy. Is that empathy often works as a spotlight, as a searchlight, where you can really focus on someone you really care about, who's on the news, for example, or who's close to you because it's a coworker or a friend or a family member. But it's very hard to feel empathy for 100,000 people or for 7 billion people, right? That's where it becomes difficult because then people become more abstract. So there's actually a good case to be made that what we need here is maybe not more empathy, because usually what happens is that we feel empathy for our own people, and then we sort of have the tendency to maybe dehumanize those other people who are far away from us. Maybe what we need is sort of a way to zoom out a little bit. Some psychologists call this compassion. Others say, well, that's just, we need some kind of rationality to do that. But maybe just empathy, just feeling what other people are feeling, is not always going to work, because humans are just limited creatures. We can't feel what 7 billion people feel.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, because I was educated to be empathic. That's how I was brought up, and I get satisfaction from it because it allows me to connect with people in a way that perhaps I wouldn't otherwise. But on the other hand, the need for survival and to protect myself and those that are near me takes precedence over empathy. I wasn't sure if you were saying that are we not able to feel empathic about the people in the war in Syria because it's been going on too long and there's so many people involved? I don't know if that's the argument of that book that you were referring to, which I don't know. And what is the distinction between empathy and compassion? I'm not sure that I know. I mean, I perceive a difference between sympathy and empathy. It's one thing to sympathize and to take action. It's quite another to be able to honestly say that you are allowing yourself to feel something and are moved by that. But maybe this is a discussion for another time.
Well, I think it's actually a really important discussion. So empathy, most people see it as trying to step into someone else's shoes and sort of feeling what the other person is feeling. I think compassion is more about sort of keeping the distance. I'm not exactly feeling what you are feeling, but I am seeing you and I am trying to understand you. And I am, I sort of have an attitude of love and caring, and I want to help you. So as a parent, people often experience the difference between empathy and compassion, because if a kid is afraid of the dark, you don't want to feel that feeling, right? You're not going to sit in the corner with your kid, like saying, oh yeah, it's very scary here. No, you want to have the approach of compassion, right? Where you don't actually feel what the other person is feeling, but you do want to help. So I think that's an important distinction.
I think then we're talking about semantics here, because, I think maybe there's a lot of us who would think that they're pretty much equivalent. But I would agree with you. If you're a parent, you need to be able to feel, to a certain extent, what your child is feeling, so that you can take action based on that. But again, these are small distinctions. But I do think there is a difference between that and sympathy. Again, this may not be appropriate for this discussion, because sympathy is a way of being really able to keep a distance, I think. So anyway.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come to Adnan now, if I may. I know Adnan doesn't have video, but had an interesting point to make. Are you there?
Hey, sorry, yeah, unfortunately I don't have a video, but I just wanted to raise the point that there seems to be this assumption that human nature is reducible to evolutionary theory. And I feel like, rather than, understanding human nature through our evolution, human nature is almost, in my opinion, sort of a reflection of the economic, political, social, and educational infrastructure of our times. The concept of how we understand ourselves and the metrics for understanding ourselves are constantly shifting, throughout every half century. I mean, a lot of the French post-structuralist thought was primarily designed at this kind of idea. So I mean, even the ideas of kindness, empathy, even these ideas are, I struggle to sort of understand what exactly that means, because the idea of kindness relates to so many different types of behaviors from so many different perspectives. And then I guess another point that I wanted to raise was that I guess there's a difference between kindness in interactions with each other, and kindness as a concept that relates to how our actions emerge out of each other. And what I mean by that is that it seems very easy to understand each other as kind when we see each other in the street or see each other at school or whatever. But if we take a step back and look at the way that all of our actions together emerge and the sort of things that appear then, inequality, destruction of the earth, are these things kind? So I think there maybe needs to be a distinction between kindness in social interaction and then kindness, how we navigate ourselves as a society.
I love that question about human nature. The interesting thing is that for a very long time, people on the left and progressives were a little bit afraid of evolutionary anthropology, or they really disliked it at least, because they thought that it would sort of lead them into a social Darwinist direction, where survival of the fittest meant survival of the strongest. And indeed, I mean, there's a long history of Darwinism being abused by fascists, by Hitler, as a way to justify hierarchy and the most horrible things. So what has been the position of many people on the left and progressives in the 20th century is that human nature doesn't really exist, that we're basically a blank slate and that everything depends on circumstances, on culture, on economics, on history, whatever. I think that we've sort of, or that people on the left and progressives have gone in the wrong direction there, or they've thrown away, how do you say that? Is that an expression in English? Throwing away the child with the bathwater? We say that in Dutch. Oh, it's in English as well. Great.
Maybe after bathwater, yeah.
Anyway, because what's so fascinating about what evolutionary anthropologists are saying right now is that it is in human nature to be cultural. So we are adapted to be cultural and to build a collective brain, collective knowledge, and to learn from each other. And that is really what distinguishes us from other species. So if you ask the question, why us? Why that we conquer the globe, or at least why are we everywhere, basically? Why not the Neanderthals? Why not the bonobos or the chimpanzees? Well, it's not that we're so smart. If you do an intelligence test and let a human toddler compete with a pig, then often the pig wins. So on an individual level, actually many animals are just as smart as we are, or maybe sometimes even smarter. And people should keep that in mind when they eat bacon, but that's another book. So it's not that we're so smart. It's also not that we're very powerful or strong or whatever. We're not that muscular. Our real secret superpower is our ability to work together and to connect and to learn from each other. So social learning is what biologists call it. That's really where we excel. And that basically means is social learning is our ability to be cultural, to build cultures and to memorize things as a society together. So I think that sort of solves the age-old nature-nurture debate, or the debate, does human nature actually exist? Well, it does exist. We have evolved to be cultural and to learn from each other. And what you do need for that is a certain, well, you can obviously talk about whether that's kindness. I like the word friendliness. I mean, you can't build a culture if you don't actually talk to each other, if you don't have language, if you don't communicate. So that is something that you still see within our bodies today. We are the only species in the animal kingdom who have the ability to blush, very unique ability. There are some parrots who maybe can do it. It's not conclusive evidence. But apart from that, we're the only ones. So we involuntarily give away our feelings to someone else. Same is true for our eyes, are very unique. We've got eyes where we can track each other's gazes because we've got white around our sclera. So if people can see, I'm looking in the camera right now and now looking to the left and the right. That really helps to helps us to communicate. And that is something that is not culture, that is in our nature. We've been shaped by evolution to be able to do that. This is, again, why I think that people who are progressive or on the left shouldn't be so afraid of evolutionary anthropology or evolutionary biology, because it could actually support their cause. They could find out that, for example, we've evolved in small scale egalitarian societies with little hierarchy, where shame plays a very important role. I don't know, it could actually help the political project.
I want to come in a minute to Jennifer Allerton, but just before we do, Rutger, clearly the book must have been, by definition, written and completed before COVID. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that your last book made a very strong and much noted case for universal basic income. Which at that time, it was an idea that you and a number of thinkers were associated with, very controversial. One of the, I think, unexpected consequences of the pandemic, and it's certainly something we've talked a lot about at Tortoise, is that although it would be wrong to say that the world has suddenly become converted to UBI, there have been forms of payment directly or via employers to employees who've been furloughed, or in the States directly to individuals, which have some of the DNA of UBI. And it's as if an idea that was, previously still the stuff of local pilots, trials, very localized schemes, books such as your own, has now kind of got into the bloodstream of politics. And because it is such a live issue, and not just because of COVID, but because of automation and the potential for job loss and so on. Where are your thoughts on that particular issue right now?
Well, it's been so fascinating to see how these ideas that used to be dismissed as unreasonable and unrealistic have really been moving into the mainstream. I don't know if you've seen the editorial in the Financial Times of last April. It really, it shocked me quite a bit, because here you have the world's, I think, most renowned business paper was suddenly arguing that we need to reverse the policy direction of the last 40 years and think about higher taxes on the rich, a more activist role for government and investing in a Green New Deal, and indeed also a basic income. So if you would have told me that 6 years ago or 7 years ago, I would have said, well, that's very highly unlikely. That's probably not going to happen. And well, look, what happens with crises is that people are in favor of certain ideas before the crisis, and then when there's a crisis, they say, yes, and now is exactly the right time to implement all my ideas that I've been so fond of. So I think it's not very surprising that I'm still a fan of basic income. I still think it's an idea whose time has come. But what was most interesting, I think, is that many governments were basically forced to go in that direction, because, you know, the standard or the old approach, you know, where you have a lot of distrust and bureaucracy and where people have to prove over and over again that they're sick enough, that they're poor enough, that they're really a hopeless case that will never get anything done in their lives. That was simply impossible. You can't do that. If millions of people need support, if we would have gone that way, then the whole economy would have crashed. So basically governments were forced to trust businesses and freelancers and many employees that they wouldn't, you know, abuse the whole system. And I think we can say quite confidently now that obviously you can find exceptions here and there, but that, yes, it did work pretty well. So it has been a huge involuntarily, you know, basic income experiment by these governments. And there's just more evidence on the pile that we already have.
So Jen Allison is there. Perhaps you'd like to, Jen, hi, how are you? We can't hear you. Can you unmute?
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now. Welcome.
Yeah, it was going. I was quite pleased that you brought up basic income just before as well, because that is one of my sort of pet topics that I think I've brought up a few different Tortoise ThinkIns. So yeah, that was interesting to hear. But I'd forgotten I had my hand up actually. It was going back to talking about the Against Empathy book and the conversation around empathy you were having with Jane, which was something that was quite interesting to me as someone who's recently been referred to autistic spectrum services and kind of discovering more about myself in that way. And people often misunderstand the idea that people with autism have sort of feel empathy in different ways as them having no empathy at all. Whereas often it's the case of having almost too much, or being autistic people are often either oversensitive or undersensitive to different stimuli, which can be emotional or physical. So empathy can be one of those. And one thing I struggle with, which I have in common with a lot of my friends who have similar conditions, is not having that divide that you spoke about between having empathy for people in my immediate life and people who I'm close to and know well, and having empathy for just anyone I might run into, or people in the news, or, you know, people with more distance between me. And I don't have that kind of divide. So it almost becomes a necessity for me to rationalize things and think about it. I like try to distance myself, because otherwise I feel too much, and that's when I shut down.
That is super fascinating.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear that idea of empathy not always being a good thing, because that is the thing. Sometimes it's too much for me, because you get the empathy fatigue. And
so you're saying that sort of the problem you run into sometimes is that there's too little distance, actually, that sort of you would feel empathy even for strangers or people who you can't help.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just that overwhelming feeling of too much, you know, needing to kind of do something about it, or just sort of too much emotion, because I have empathy for people in a different way to people who don't have Asperger's or autistic.
Well, that really reminds me of Greta Thunberg. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that this 16-year-old Swedish girl was the one to kickstart the biggest climate justice movement the world has ever seen. And she herself calls her Asperger, calls it her I think she calls it her superpower, sort of that she can just see things in a way that most people can't do, because most people, you know, with the average human nature are limited. We're just limited, that we don't care enough about climate change, where she can clearly see and clearly feel empathy, not just for, you know, her rich compatriots in Sweden or for those in her neighborhood, but she can really feel it for the whole world. So there's so much to learn from that, and I really, really look up to that. And I mean, yeah, you can just see the extraordinary power if people are being moved by that. But I can also imagine that it's quite often a burden, and it's hard to deal
sometimes
with.
Exhausting. Yeah.
Yeah. Very
Thank you
interesting.
So much.
Thanks so much.
Could we come to David Griffiths now, who had a very interesting question about one of the points in your book. David, I don't know if you're there. Hi, David. You're still on mute, I think.
Hi, I've just unmuted.
Yeah,
thank you. Hi, Rutger. Thank you for some fascinating material, and I really enjoyed and was very inspired by your book Humankind, which I recently finished reading. And one of the things that really intrigued me about that was your very strong prescription to avoid reading the news. And I must say, I've directly, as a result of reading that, have changed my news consumption pattern. And I need to keep on top of the news for the work that I do. But I really understand what you mean about how the stories that we tell ourselves, tell each other, become true and become self-fulfilling, and the news has such an important role in that. So I'm interested to know, first of all, what you read, and secondly, to know if you have any thoughts on whether there's potential for things to be done differently, and how you see the potential for reform within the media industry. Thank you.
Love that question. So let's first make a distinction between the news and journalism. The news is the sensational reporting on incidents that happen today instead of the stuff that happens every day. So a lot of what we call journalism is actually the news, but not all journalism is the news. There's also really good and important journalism that speaks truth to power, that helps us to focus on the structural forces that really govern our lives. There's a lot of constructive journalism out there that not only talks about the problems, but also the solutions. And I think that's what we need. So people got to subscribe to great magazines, to newspapers who do that kind of work. A simple recommendation is often that you can just start at the back of the newspaper, because often there are the deeper stories are at the back. So, or you can just read the Saturday's newspaper or the Sunday's newspapers instead of the stuff that comes out every day. Or you can just simply ask yourself the question: do I still want to read this tomorrow? So with a standard newspaper, you don't want to see it tomorrow, or with a standard news bulletin on TV, you're not interested in it if it's from yesterday, which I think clearly shows you how worthless the information is. If it's not even, if you don't even want to see it a day later, then it must be completely worthless. I think a good magazine or a good newspaper should be readable a year from now, or preferably 5 or maybe even 10 years from now. That's sort of what I had in mind while I was writing this book. I wanted to write a book that people could still read 10 years from now, which is actually really, really hard if you do that, because you realize that so much of the science, it might not be replicated. Something that's on the cover of Nature or Science, two of the great scientific journals that we have, might not be replicated and maybe debunked a year later. So that is, I think, a good question to have in your mind when you are thinking about what to read or what kind of information you want to consume. Is this going to hold up? Then one very practical thing you can do is use Twitter in the right way. So what I do is I follow, I think, around 500 people that I think are really, really interesting. And what I then do is that I don't go on Twitter, or I try to avoid that as much as possible, but I use Nozzle, which is an app that sort of collects all the links that people in my Twitter feed have shared. So I only see the articles that are shared. And obviously the articles that are shared the most by people that I follow on Twitter get to the top. So that is my daily newspaper that I start with, which are just the 500 people that I think are really interesting, which are scientists and experts and activists from around the globe. I just look in the morning, okay, what have my people recommended for me to read today? So that is something I can really recommend.
So thank you, Rutger. We're drawing quite close to the end of the hour, sadly, but one thing I wanted to ask you before we end is about the way ahead. You end the book, and I don't want to offer any spoilers with a series of recommendations, but we're there's clearly going to be no Big Bang moment on which we walk into the post-COVID world, but we are taking baby steps back into it. And as we do that, do you do so more hopefully or less hopefully than when you started the book? And how do you see the ideas in the book being of use in the new world into which we'll be coming in, which we'll be shaping?
Well, as you know, historians get really, really bad, and they often talk crap when they start talking about the future. They're okay when they talk about the past, but when it's about the future, so bear that in mind when you listen to what I'm going to say now. It's pretty easy to imagine a dark path going forward. I mean, just think about the prospects of Trump getting elected again. I mean, Brexit is now going to happen. You see the rise, or you see the survival of the shameless in our politics. Whether you look at Modi in India or Bolsonaro in Brazil, somehow we've ended up in a democratic system that seems to elect the most shameless people. And we know that crises are often abused by those in power. There's a lot of examples: burning of the Reichstag, ascent of Adolf Hitler, 9/11, 2 illegal wars in the Middle East. So yeah, you don't need a lot of imagination to imagine us going down a dark path. But then on the other hand, there are also really hopeful signs. I mean, we've already talked about this extraordinary shift where ideas that seem to be were very long dismissed as unreasonable have been moving into the mainstream. You could argue that, and this is, I hope that this is going to be an interpretation 20 or 30 years from now, that for decades we've been living in the neoliberal era with the defining values of competition and individualism, and that now we're moving into a different kind of era, maybe a neo-realist era, where we have a new definition of what it means to be a realist. In the 90s, it was very fashionable to be a cynic. You know, we had Nirvana, Entertain Us, we had Fight Club. Back then, it was just, if you wanted to be avant-garde, you didn't believe in anything, right? Having values was something for the hippies, for if you were from the 60s. That is really changing. If you now look at young people, both in Europe and the US, they're the most progressive, most ethnically diverse, most highly educated generation the world has ever seen. And I mean, Generation Z, you know, people who are born after 1994, I think, is even more progressive than millennials. So if people are tired of millennials, just wait for what's coming after that. It's only just begun. Then you can say, well, that's just people being youthful, you know, that'll change. As they become older, they'll become more conservative. No, that's absolutely wrong. It's actually the other way around. We know that Thatcher and Reagan, you know, they were most popular with young people in the 1980s. You know, Thatcher won the youth vote. Same is true for Reagan. So demography is on the side of change. You can really see this shift in the zeitgeist coming at us. The big question is just, is it going to be fast enough? Because when we think about stuff like climate change, I mean, there's a deadline, you know, and I think we've already passed the deadline multiple times. So that is, I think, the great question for our time. I mean, change is clearly coming, and in so many ways, we've already seen a strong shift in opinion, and I think in the right direction. But is it going to be fast enough? And I don't know.
Channeling the great Sam Cooke, a change is going to come. Thank you, Rutger. Just before you go, we want to do a quick experiment with a poll, which I hope my colleague Harika can put on. There it is. So it's a multiple choice, and there we go. Do you believe that human beings are inherently good?
I'm going to vote not sure, actually.
There speaks a man publicizing his book. So it's, oh, you can actually, it's in real time. You can actually see it. Okay, and it seems to, is it settling now, or? Okay, I'm gonna, all right. Well, there you go. I think, fair play to Rutger. Do you believe that human beings are inherently good? Yes, 68%, no, 7%.
Not too bad, not too bad.
And not sure, which I would have thought would have been higher, 28%. So that's a rather excellent and optimistic note on which to end. Rutger, as ever, such a pleasure to talk to you. This is the book. It's really, really interesting. It will challenge you and make you think. Thank you very much for attending. The last time Rutger and I spoke, we went off for a curry. We can't do that tonight, but in honor of that, let's wave him off and wish him well. And I wish you all a good evening too. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.